Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 40 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm here with Curt. I'm here with the Canadian version of Jerry today. And we have a really special guest who I'm just thrilled to have, Dr. Melody Brown. And we've got a great episode. Today we're talking about microaggressions, which is a topic I've been really excited to talk about, something I've been thinking a lot about. And we titled this Microaggression and the Isms, and looking at how racism, heterosexualism, all these different sort of messages we get from people in our community and our environment can have an impact that we might call in some situations traumatic. And we're going to take a deeper dive into this with my bright, shiny object of the week, which is Dr. Melody Brown herself. It's just so fun. We were talking a little bit before the episode Facebook allows me to feel like I'm keeping in touch with people, even though I'm passively doing so. And it's just great. I take a little bit of credit that I really convinced Melody to run a community-based program called Family to Family. She stepped in some really big shoes with a well-known guy in the community that was started that program and just did a fabulous job. It's one of those people, Curt, we talk about leadership all the time. When you put the right person in the right position, and then you just look smart as a supervisor manager. And she made me look like a brilliant individual. And one of the things I saw on Facebook recently is got her doctorate degree. So to say the words Dr. Melody Brown brings a huge smile to my face, because I know that wasn't a simple, easy thing for her to do, especially working full-time and all of that. So she is my bright, shiny object of the week, and I'm so excited to have her on the podcast. So, Curt, what about you? What are you thinking about this week?
Well, congratulations, Dr. Brown. That's really awesome.
Big time.
I came across a fun book that I thought was really good. It's called The Game Theorist's Guide to Parenting.
Ooh.
It's pretty cool. It has some nice little strategies in there that I think gives parents and caregivers something to do when you're in the negotiation with a child, which we're always in. Like, it always happens that way. But it gives you something to kind of regulate yourself and have a strategy for thinking about that situation. And it really involves getting input from the child. And I think that was really cool. So it's a great book. We can put a link up to it on the website. It's kind of a fun little read. Pretty interesting book.
Awesome. Jerry, I know in Canada this week, did we send you up there to keep peace during the G7 summit? And how did you do? Seemed to be some fallout there.
What I came up here is to hold the affect of the Canadian people. They're having in reaction to, right? And so really they've been very kind in how they're expressing their aggression around some of these events that are going on. So it's an interesting time to be visiting Canada. However, they all are very, very kind and understanding, and what it's like to have a father figure who's so abusive, right? So they're both kind. They're trauma people, so they understand that, to kind of look at that. But I do want to take a moment to kind of recognize Whole Services, which is a treatment center up here, both residential and community-based, and the CTA, Child Trauma Academy, for putting on an event for people from 11 nations in the world coming together up here talking about trauma, childhood trauma, talking about really the craziness around things they call evidence-based treatments.
Mm-hmm.
That there really is no evidence that those treatments really work with everybody, right? So it's kind of, so this is really about the concept of no matter how you go, you still have to do really good treatment planning, really have to connect with the person that's right in front of you and develop goals together and then strategies together to kind of maximize the benefit of a therapeutic process. So it's just a nice place to get to where people are thinking level-headedly about really this concept that healing takes place in the context of a safe relationship.
Very cool. And just for those people that might be listening, these not in June of 2018, the joke about the G7 is our president here in the United States threw a man fit again about is it the Prime Minister, I think, of Canada? Wow, look at my knowledge of Canada. I will move on from that. I just wanted to put out there to put the joke in context. Jerry, can you give us, I want to get your little experience on our guest today too, because I know this isn't the first time you've had an interesting conversation with our friend Mel too.
So just to put some things in context, Mel and I worked together for a long time in a residential day treatment and community-based program. And you know, one of the things you could always count on Mel to do is to be thoughtful and bring some reflection to the process. Is that you know that in environments in where we're working not just with people who have been injured, people who have been hurt, people who have been marginalized, there's a lot of affect. Right? So people really get really wound up about the experiences that especially the children have had and feel like they need to do something. And I think Mel was always a force for helping people stop and be reflective, and then making sure in some ways the way we responded was really a therapeutic response rather than a reactive response to an event. And I think she always brought that groundedness to the process. So it's really neat to have you on our podcast. And I think the people listening today are going to get a real treat to kind of hear the things you have to say.
Absolutely. Dr. Brown, I'll let you do a little bit more formal introduction and just give us something you're kind of thinking about, reading about right now in your work and life.
Sure. First off, my name is Dr. Melody Brown, and I hold several different hats in life, as we all do. My primary time is spent at the University of Colorado, Denver in the counseling center. And so my job here is working with newer clinicians to get them kind of prepared for their first experiences in working with clients. I also hold my own caseload here. And some of the things that I do that I love are my private practice is exclusively right now supervision. I'm going to be opening that up in coming weeks to take on more clients. But I also teach a group supervision class. And so I'm just very passionate about trying to get folks to be reflective about who they are, to use Jerry's words, in the context of other people on the margins. And what does that mean when you consider yourself a clinician and in the space of holding somebody's pain, when they've got all these other contexts in their lives that may not even get touched or talked about or discussed or recognized, that are feeding into some of the reasons why they're coming into you in the first place. So that's who I am. In the bright and shiny part of things, I'm still got my Jamaica glow, so that's my kind.
I saw the pictures yesterday. Wow.
That's enough right there.
That was bright and shiny. Yes.
and you know me. So Jerry, like I'm sitting here thinking, wow, I'm gonna struggle with like people like waiting on me hand and foot in this industry, and what does this mean in terms of, yeah, no, within 20 seconds, I was gone. I was
Awesome. Yeah, I saw those pictures. They look like you had a good time. So beautiful pictures too. Beautiful pictures. So let's dive into the topic. And Mel, you know, microaggressions are something that I'm hearing more and more about. I think it's a fascinating and really important topic. And I wanted to throw it to you first to sort of give us a definition for us to work with throughout the episode and help for those maybe in our audience who haven't really heard the term microaggressions, help us put that in context a little bit.
Of course. And I'm going to quote a little bit here, so as to honor the folks that that have done a lot of the work around microaggressions. Primarily, Daryl Wayne Sue, and his definition is that a microaggression is a common daily encounter with people of a majority group that denigrate messages to people of a particular minority group. And so it's not limited to a particular context. So it can apply in terms of race, religion, sexual orientation, sexism. There are many ways that it can show up.
Yeah. And so when we think about this, I kind of want to throw it around, maybe going to Jerry first, just sort of how have you know, with your thinking of trauma, Jerry, how does microaggression sort of fit into your thinking at this point?
So, you know, trauma is about survival, right? And so an individual who lives in an unsafe environment, their nervous system has to become sensitized to certain potential threats, certain potential danger that's potentially there. And I used the analogy on here before that, you know, I have asthma and things fly all around the environment that have no impact on anybody. But because I have asthma, I'm exquisitely designed to pick up and react to things that have happened, right? So the analogy I have is that individuals who in some ways have to live in a social environment where where they're not recognized, where they're not valued, there are certain comments and statements that may be conscious of this from the sender or maybe unconscious from the sender, but the person received it, their bodies are exquisitely designed to in some ways respond to those words of aggression, right? It activates a stress response in them and a defensive protective response in them. And so when you live as a, whether it's your religion, whether it's the color of your skin, whether it's your sexual orientation, you have to really, in some ways, become really sensitized to potential aggression from other people in your environment. And in that state, it's very hard to what we call this kind of safe, relaxed social engagement place, right? Unless you're around other people that kind of do it. So I think about it in this kind of trauma way of understanding these kind of messages constantly that are activating this need to defend oneself, this need to kind of protect oneself, this need to where other people in the environment may not react, right? And so our tendency really is to kind of then put the blame on the person who is being injured, as opposed to understanding how these kind of events are occurring in the environment and how they occur more frequently for people who live in an unsafe social context.
Great. Melody, I'll give you a chance to unpack sort of that and add thoughts to what Jerry just said.
Sure. As Jerry, as you were talking, I was thinking about just a couple different ways. One thing that I did not do was situate myself within the topic. And so I think it's important to think about identities and how some of that intersects and overlaps. And for me, I am a member of the queer community. I don't check a box per se. Just my philosophy about that is that checking a box only means that if I say I'm a lesbian, then that means that someone has an idea about what that means, and they then get to respond based on that meaning rather than getting to know me. And so I don't necessarily check a box, but I do identify as a part of the queer community. Also identify as an African-American woman, and so who came from a religious background. And so you start mixing all three of those things together, even the fourth, being a woman, and that's a mix for some stuff to probably happen, right? I recall just yesterday having some conversations about, those of us in the queer community who decide to come out at a very young age, and just the amount of courage that takes, because the trauma that's associated with that. Imagine thinking just from the beginning, who I am in the world is wrong. And it's so wrong that I can't tell people about this, because if I do, I literally could lose everything. And there's some truth to that. There's so much truth to that. Teens who identify as some member of the, however they establish their identities in the queer community, if they tell their parents, some of them are very likely to be thrown out, disowned, become homeless, and face all kinds of things as a result of that. And so without even going through the coming out process, there's little pieces of trauma that are kind of setting up because of the fear of that wrongness being validated and then acted upon.
Absolutely. And, we see, I think all of us have seen, whether working with children or adults, the impact of that kind of barrage. I almost think about, and sometimes, and correct me if my thinking's totally off, but microaggressions are kind of like if you're out in a rainstorm and all the raindrops are the microaggressions hitting you, and all of a sudden a lightning bolt can also hit you as a traumatic event because of this as well. And I just, living that way, I just have so much empathy. And when we see the high rates of suicide and homelessness, especially, I think there's been a lot of attention paid to the transgender community. It's heartbreaking. And so, all these messages come into this, again, as we talk about this messages of who I am. And, if the rain can stay outside of me, maybe I can survive the storm. But I think too often that seeps in too. And
it does seep in. It does seep in. Like, imagine a child who is non-gender conforming and not on the binary in any way in terms of their sexual identity or how they even view themselves. The idea of waking up in the morning and feeling as if you are a woman and going to the mirror and realizing you've got stubble and you've got to shave and that doesn't match what you feel like you are on the inside. And then let's just fast forward that thought 20 minutes from now to a possible walk to school and what could happen on that walk to school, just being who you are.
Yeah.
And I think just the idea about, I think about anxiety, I think about, people misunderstanding anger and rage. I think there's so many different layers to it that, it would take us days just to go through a lot of it, I think.
Absolutely.
Think about waking up in the morning, you're not feeling like outwardly who you look like is not who you are on the inside. And you go to the mirror and you're like, damn it, I guess this isn't me. And then you got to walk out the door and face the world.
Yeah.
And they're going to do something with that.
Absolutely. And Curt, I want to go to you to think about what Mel's saying and these messages. Again, if my analogy at least is a functional one about being out in the rain and getting all these different messages. And I love how Mel set it up. Maybe from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, and maybe even in your, dreams as well, as we carry that into the sleep with us. From your perspective, how do you see all these messages that so many folks are getting, and if you put your behavioralist hat on, which I know is not hard for you, how do you see this from your perspective?
I heard a couple of kind of overarching concepts in both what Jerry said and what Melody was saying. One, and that made me think about kind of a couple of things that are important for optimal development and optimal psychological functioning. And one is a sense of oneself, some kind of self-awareness, some kind of idea of self-concept. And the other part of that is how one fits into a social group. And both of those interact with one another. And so as you kind of use Melody's example of I feel kind of different in my skin than what my outward appearance is, that is a difficulty or a challenge with a sense of oneself. And that kind of challenge with a sense of oneself really impacts how one fits in with a group. And that kind of led me thinking a little bit to a couple of different pretty prominent writers and speakers in the field. And one was Kelly McGonigal, and the other is Robert Sapolsky. And they both talk about oxytocin and what that does to our sense of belonging to a group. And of course, Kelly McGonigal, she has a great TED Talk about it if you watch it. She writes a lot about the upside of stress. That stress is something that organizes our ability to want to attach to other people and be around others. And the oxytocin is one of those, she calls it the cuddle hormone, right? Well, Sapolsky kind of goes on the other side of oxytocin, that not only does it make us want to affiliate with others, it also makes us really kind of magnify divisions between people that we see as not the same as us. So both things happen there. And I heard kind of both of those things kind of in what you were describing, Melody, of I have a problem fitting in with a social group, and I have a little bit of a problem understanding myself and how I fit into that group. And that kind of stress, those messages that you're talking about, really kind of think about those as kind of the cortisol drip, one drip at a time. The stress response keeps going up and up and up. And pretty quickly you're in a position where you could see biologically that you would have a lot of hormones being activated, a lot of oxytocin kind of coursing through your brains. And then that's got this impact of kind of magnifying affiliation with people we see as the same and magnifying division between people we see as different. And both of those are going to be operating kind of simultaneously with everybody around, right? Like as Jerry was talking about, I was thinking of working in a residential treatment center, where one of the things that was really challenging for us was we happened to have a referral source that sent us quite a few teenagers from a reservation. And I had to learn this, right? Really by screwing it up a lot. I think that's how I learned most things. That I had to learn about the whole idea of the Indian schools, years and years and years ago, right? Where really we were trying to kind of the predominant majority white culture was trying to acculturate Native Americans, and would take kids and send them to a school and teach them how to be white. And all of those kids' parents, now their kids were the ones that were getting sent to my residential treatment center. I had to learn about that and be like, wow, holy cow, we're doing it again. And they would come in, and I had to kind of understand how these teenagers who were coming, some of them really wanted it, right? They wanted to kind of get out of a bad situation that they had gotten in socially. And it was nice for them to have a break from the situation that they were in, but it still had this effect on them. And all of the people around them, which were predominantly young college graduates, most of them were white, they didn't understand what was going on with this poor Native kid who was really struggling to be a part of this environment. And the struggles of doing that, and the ideas of in-groups and out-groups, and all of those things were operating all the time. And those are just struggles that are going to continue on a moment-to-moment basis. And how we go through those is really quite a challenge. But it is something that is a part of the work that I think that we need to address and be aware of. And that really is our first step towards kind of making the problem somewhat better, ameliorating some of the problems that can occur in that situation. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of thoughts kind of jumbled in my head as you guys were talking, because it's pretty complicated. And there are lots of kind of variables to be aware of. And really, the more we become aware of things, the more complicated it seems to get. So that can be quite a challenge, to be open to hearing what some of the things that you may be doing, right? I'm a white guy, right? So I may be doing microaggressions and I don't even know about it. Yeah. And to hear about those can be a challenge. And being able to kind of manage through some of the defensive reactions that come up when you find out I did something that offended somebody. You're like, well, crap, I didn't want to do that. Right. So those are some of the real challenges that I think need to be worked through.
And Mel, I'd love to get, if you feel comfortable, some of your kind of experiences with this as well, as you sort of put yourself, again, identified some of the how you enter this conversation, not just from a professional standpoint. And I just kind of, what Curt's saying, what Jerry's saying, sort of, what's just some of your experiences, and how do you help that to inform the work that you do with young or upcoming clinicians, and also I know as a therapist as well.
Sure. I'll try to talk about it from almost sort of the pastoral standpoint of the 1, 2, 3 point. First point, to go back to some of what Curt was saying, and Curt maybe at some point helping us flesh this out a little bit, when it was interesting to hear how you framed what we were talking about, because I think about, in some ways, I remember working with a kid at DCH who was dealing with some psychosis, pretty severe. And in some ways, internally, there was no dissonance for him. Mm-hmm. Like yes, there are these voices, and they weren't commands, so it wasn't like a safety issue in the moment. It was his world. It was a world that was familiar to him, and so in some ways, the homogeneity of that wasn't problematic with just him. It's when the larger context got involved, right? When you try to operate in a world that isn't the same as yours. And so similarly, growing up in Louisiana around Blackness, I was surrounded by people who looked like me for most of the time. And so there was a safety in that until I went into a world that, was white and quite obvious about dislikes of African Americans. And so I'm in my setting, in my familial setting, even in my school, because my parents were very intentional to send me to a Catholic school that was Black. And so there was safety there. But you step outside of that realm and outside of that world, and then things became quite unsafe. And so when I say unsafe, I don't mean in the sense of growing up Philando Castile unsafe, like you're going to stop and the police are going to shoot you in the face. I mean, just a sense of, okay, you got to watch your surroundings. You're an African-American person, right? So that's points 1 and 2. But then we started getting into the place where, for my experiences growing up as well, when you start mixing in things around sexuality, then in your very small context, in your neighborhood, in your school, in your church setting, then that's where the dissonance comes in, because that homogeneity isn't there anymore. There's this place where I'm no longer like everybody else. And so I didn't have overt struggles with that so much in terms of sexuality and Blackness, But I think the reason why I didn't was because I didn't start my coming out process until I went to my PhD program. And so I left my environment altogether, and that's where my process began. So I think that's one example. And so that, Jerry, as a matter of fact, you were around, you and Matt were around for another instance. We were at a tournament raising money, golf tournament. And I remember sitting with, I can't remember what her position was, but we were sitting at one of the holes. And so we were there to kind of greet people and everything. And one guy came up, very nice guy, conversing with us and talking with us. And, we were laughing and joking a little bit. And he said something and then pat me on my head. Like, I'm a grown ass woman. What are you doing? And so here comes that piece where, and I remember, conversations with Jerry and folks afterwards, and I had to settle myself down because Matt, to stay with your metaphor of the raindrops, like all of that rain, and I'm like, you just pat me on my head, dude. Like, I'm the director of community-based services. So, having all of the stuff that kind of sits inside me around Blackness and the not good enough because of that, and him doing that, kind of, it set off my personal storm for a while. Mm-hmm. And I remember having to settle myself in and figure out how to be one with that again and be okay with myself again. Yeah. And so, that's just one example. It doesn't include the sexuality piece, but that's just one example.
Well, and I think, and Jerry, I want to get your thoughts in a second, but I think that example is such a powerful one because you're not always in a position to confront the behavior too. I think that's, because what are you, I think I was in a different hole, like, right. Here, we want your money, so I'm not going to give you necessarily, and I think, when I think about this, I have, and, as a white man with all being very conscious of the privilege I have and trying to make all my unconscious biases as conscious as possible so they don't impact my work, I think, as a public speaker as well. I want to be aware of everything. You always offend somebody in the room, but I want to know who I offend, why I offended, so I don't do it again. But it's putting people in those positions so often, and I think sometimes walking through life of this is you're put in a position where, in this case, maybe professionally, you probably, if somebody did that up in a restaurant, just walked up to you and did that, you may give them, teach them sort of a lesson, because, if they were at the golf tournament for a residential treatment, probably there's some good in that individual. And yet, there's these positions where you just have to hold that inside. And that to me has been a big lesson of this, and talking about this and having open conversations is, and Jerry, my question I want to throw to you is sort of what do you see as some of the mental health impacts of going through scenarios like this, if not on an hourly basis in some ways, daily, on a regular basis at least, and how, especially for somebody maybe with a traumatic history already, right, how does this play into your conceptualization of people and how this impacts their mental health?
Well, one is I want to be careful not to say something that generalizes something to everybody, because I don't know everybody. Really, what I do want to say is, what I'm hearing and what I experienced is that when we're born into the world, we're waiting for someone to show up who not only is there to meet our physical needs, but there is to kind of communicate with us non-verbally, that what I'm feeling inside, you get. And when you get it, you communicate back to me some level of acceptance of that, right? And it's in this interactional process that not only I learn to regulate my experience, but also I learn to put value on my experience. I learn to take pride in my sense of self. I end up feeling like I'm enough, like I don't have to do things in order to be loved. I don't have to do, just being born into this world and you looking and smiling in my eyes makes me feel like I'm of value, right? And that happens in the context of a relationship, right? And it's hundreds of thousands of repetitions of what I'm feeling you hold, so that part of me becomes acceptable, right? And what I hear from Mel is that she lived in this place where there was a lot of people around her who accepted a lot of her, right? I'm black, they're black, they smile, they do it. And that the resonance that she was getting was, you know what? This is an all right place, man. I fit in here, right? But there was this part of her that, whether it was true or it's not true, but the experience of that this piece of me is unacceptable, I have to find some way to disassociate that piece, right? I have to somehow, in order to be connected to you, I have to disassociate this piece of me, right? And in a way, that takes a lot of energy to disassociate that. But it also begins to, your internal judgment of that piece becomes clouded with what you think this interaction. So this part of me is bad because if I ever show this piece to you, I'll be rejected and I'll be bad. And so therefore I'm bad, right? And so anything that comes along that might in some ways expose that before you're ready to expose it becomes traumatic, right? So we know doing work with trauma, we don't go in and say, oh, just, come in my office today, let me expose your trauma and I'm gonna you're gonna be better. Really what I have to do is create this safe relational environment to be able to feel safe enough to expose this piece, not to you, but to me first. And then I can integrate it into myself, right? And so when you look at this place, when I hear from Mel, there was a number of things that the courage she showed is, not only did I leave this place where this larger piece of me felt safe and protected, but now I had this other piece in me. What the hell do I do with this piece, right? I'm not even feeling safe with this whole piece, and now I have this other piece. And I think that in some ways, I either have to find some place in the world that's protected and safe, or I've got to develop the internal resources and courage to reintegrate that piece back into myself, to kind of look at that part, right? And I think that there's a reflection of, if I reintegrate this piece of me and I'm feeling strong, I got to be able to tolerate the raindrops out here. They're not going to go away, but how do I create the internal and external resources to be able to tolerate those raindrops?
Yeah.
Right? And so I think what Mel's talking about happens to a lot of trauma victims in different kinds of ways. Right? So it could be around, I was sexually abused and now I have to disown my sexuality. That becomes a dirty piece of me, a part that is unacceptable. If I'm in a relationship with people as I grow up, I go to school, I may look like everybody else and I may do it, but there's this part of me in here that if you ever knew these pieces about me, you would not like me. And yet we know disowning it doesn't make it go away. It comes out in all sorts of ways. It may come out in physical health. It may come out in behavior. It may come out in me having to be so overly compliant to kind of manage it so you don't see that piece. So I'm really, both hearing that in some situations, color is not a is not a trauma, because if you're around everybody that looks like you, eats like you, talks like you to do it, that may not be a potential a trigger for you, right, to kind of do it. But when you leave the safety of that environment, as you talk about Robert Sapolsky, the in-group and the out-group, is by the very nature of it, I'm in an unsafe situation. Mm-hmm. So that my nervous system has to become, I've got to move out of social engagement and into a defensive state.
Right.
Right? That's just as a whole. And then you have these other pieces of yourself that you're struggling with that are really in some ways disconnecting you. So when I feel scared and I feel vulnerable, I really want to seek proximity to somebody. But if I have this piece of me that I can't even own, seeking proximity becomes a conflicted process.
Yeah.
Right? And so, it really does require the individual finding both within themselves and in some social place where they can feel safe.
Yeah.
And accepted, right? And maybe that's a group of people that they get around that look like them and act like them or understand them and kind of do. But it takes a lot of courage for all of our clients to be able to reintegrate that piece of themselves that really in some ways had to be dissociated as a survival strategy.
Absolutely. And one of the things, that I've been thinking, and Curt, I know all three of us have thought about this as well, or four of us have, is disabilities too. And I think about this, it's kind of interesting being a 6'7" guy in the world. And I don't say it's hard being a 6'7" guy, because there's actually research that says that tall people make more money. I obviously really entered the wrong field. But being tall and male,
statistics, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm pulling us down, and I apologize to all my tall brothers and sisters out there. But people interact with me in a different way. And people will come up to me, and, I would never, at least, and I'm hyper conscious of this, go up to somebody and say, hey, how much do you weigh? Or, boy, you're short. How short are you? Or how's the weather down there, short person? There's things that I would never say. Nobody has a problem coming up to you as a 6'7" guy and commenting on your height. Again, something that I'm not, I sort of won that physical lottery, if you want to. And again, I apologize for bringing the salary status of my height class down. But I think about both disabilities and also, the physical aspect of maybe seeing somebody on the street that you assume is experiencing homelessness as well. And Curt, I just kind of want to, because a lot of times we miss this category of people when we talk about microaggressions, just how some of this can potentially impact people with physical, mental disabilities as well. And just kind of maybe some of your experiences working with that population pretty heavily over time.
Yeah, what pops into my head immediately when you bring in the disability.
Welcome back.
Hey, Melody. Is the idea of what's called diagnostic overshadowing. And that is a concept that is, when we see symptoms, and typically when we hear those in the disability community and the IDD community especially, we talk a lot about people engaging in behavior that's somehow problematic to the rest of the social environment. Aggression, self-injury, a lot of those kind of symptoms where we get in, as a kind of treatment collective, we get in the mode of, we need to make that symptom go away, right? We've got to get it to go away. Diagnostic overshadowing is the idea of attributing the cause of that behavior to a disability and not to a mental health condition. And that's very common in the disability field, and it's one that we have to combat all the time. So that happens really, really frequently. And there are some myths in the intellectual and developmental disabilities community that get kind of perpetuated because of this idea of diagnostic overshadowing. And one of those myths is that people with intellectual disabilities cannot benefit from therapy. And that's just a myth. It's not true. They can. We may have to adjust some things in our therapeutic approach, and we may need to change some of our interventions, but it is without question, it's very important that when we see mental health conditions or behavioral health conditions occurring, that we provide treatment for those, even in the disability community. So that is really common, and I think that is very common in a very common idea of a microaggression that happens in that community, right? Is there's definitely the big risk of kind of microaggressions, and not like even regular size aggression, not just small aggression, is when there are power differentials. And people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are constantly in a power differential situation with people around them. And that is one that we got to be aware of and thinking about constantly, on how do we even out those power differentials. And it's on us, if we're in positions of power, whether intentionally or not, to be aware of those power differentials and how do you navigate through those in a more sensitive way.
Absolutely. And I want to sort of shift the rest of our time to thinking about how this can inform how we function as professionals. What kind of thinking around, I mean, we talk all the time. This is episode 40, so we've talked now for 40 hours on how the knowledge of trauma can inform both our services and also how we design programs, how we think about organizations. I always try to throw a few social justice pieces in there. And I'll kind of, one of the things I'd like to add to the conversation, building on Curt and what we've all been saying, and then throw it back to Mel to get her thoughts on how this can inform our programming and services in the different realms our listeners hold, whether that's education, psychology, social work, whatever aspects that can be. And one, as I hear Curt talking, is something I've really focused on is language. I have come, my vocabulary is totally different than it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, before I really thought about this. I think we've talked on this show, using the concept homeless person is now out of my vocabulary, because you're more than your housing condition. Mentally ill. Well, that, again, it'd be nice to live in a society that doesn't stigmatize mental illness. There can be microaggressions, again, especially if it's playing out on the street or in some kind of public scenario. In my work with HIV, we used to use the word HIV positive to describe a person. Now it's a person living with HIV. So I think from the helping professions, we can even, and I talk to people all the time, is that if you have homeless in the title of your, healthcare for the homeless is a great example, and great providers, great system, named 20, 30 years ago at this point. But if I have to walk under a sign that says healthcare for homeless, in some ways it could feel like a microaggression to me, is, oh, I can't go over there for healthcare, I have to go over here for healthcare. Now, the good thing about that system is they get world-class healthcare. But at the same time, there's these things that we sort of do naturally with our language that unintentionally we sort of reinforce some of the experiences out in the environment as well. So I just kind of want to throw that in to start us transitioning to how we can think about this from a programmatic service provision perspective. And Mel, I want to turn it over to you to get some thoughts on how can our listeners kind of continue this conversation as they're thinking about program design or the services they provide.
I think that's a really large question. I think in many different ways we can look at how we start with service provision. One of the things that I try to train, not just our clinicians here with, but agencies, companies, how do we lead from a place of intentionality? And what I mean by that is a place from being mindful about how we approach not just the work that we're doing, but each other in the work that we're doing. And so something you said, you know, how we're talking about language and the use of language is so important in allowing someone to identify who they are for themselves, and how we then respectfully follow that lead is critical. When we're talking about service provision, you know, if we're talking about getting out and serving, okay, Curt, so nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Curt has to leave us a little early for a long drive today. So thanks, Curt.
Bye, Curt. But when we're thinking about service provision, always thinking about how would it be if we were to operate from a place of nothing, a friend of mine used to say, nothing about us without us. And so in providing service, how do we do that from the mindset of the consumer of that service in a way that feels respectful? And how can we know what that is without some understanding from the consumer? And so how do we then provide services from that lens of what your consumer would say is this? Or even in the table, let's say we're at a conference table and we're having this discussion and we're going to be doing some program development, and not everybody knows each other. Something very simple of going around the table and introducing who you are. Now you will hear people say, and my pronouns are.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, you know, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And so even if you're like addressing a room of people and you're about to lead them in a discussion about service provision, just how you say hello starts things off and lets people know where they are with you. And so it's some intentionality around, you know, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all beautiful beings in between, you know?
Yeah.
Some intentionality around that, and honoring the fact that we are all human beings. We're fallible. We're going to mess this up. We're going to get in our own stuff. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that we're awful beings because of that. That means we're human beings because of that. And I think we can remain humane if we just can hold some humility around, I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah. And
I'm never intending to be harmful. So how do I engage with you in a way that honors who you are?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the models that has really struck me, because I was trained as a therapist during, and I think it was like at the peak of this, hopefully it's continued. Mel, you probably know more of that than I do, but you know, culture was such a big issue. Every book that I did in undergrad and graduate work had, because we screwed it up for so long. This was a reaction, not because, hey, we've been great at this, but hey, we've really screwed this up over the years. And so that concept of sort of expertise development, of taking unconscious incompetence and bringing it into your consciousness. I remember this. I started working out with African-American youth from inner city. Most of them, about 99%, were in gangs. You know, coming from a small suburban farming town, we didn't talk the same language. And I really realized, because I knew they were calling me names, but I didn't know what the names meant. So it hit me, okay, here's an example. And it was such a beautiful thing to learn that culture. And then I was kind of like, oh man, Matt's read, because you guys know me, Matt's read now 20 books on African-American youth, and he's listened to every Master P, you know, album out there. And now he can call his friends all these cool names that Master P taught him. And so I was good. And then I moved to Denver, and in Indiana, I had no exposure to the community from Latin America. And so all of a sudden I come to Denver, and I'm like, oh, here I am again. I'm right in this, and my unconscious incompetent moment is when I had some staff members who were really patient with me, helping me learn about their culture. And my words that I'll never forget is, when is Cinco de Mayo? So all of a sudden I knew, they just looked at me and they just shook their head. And so, you know, but that gave me an opportunity to reset, to say, hey, I know nothing, but teach me. And I think that understanding, like you said, where that's at, and to enjoy the experience of learning about other people's culture, and having those genuine conversations, are key, and realizing that we will make mistakes at times, but those are chances, as Jerry said, and I'll turn it over to you, Jerry, is, you know, those breaks in the relationship are great opportunities for healing and growth on both sides. And so, Jerry, some thoughts from you as we look at wrapping up here of how can we think about this and continue this discussion in our work in organizations as well?
You know, I think, I mean, this is an interesting, it's so large, the topic, that I'm trying to get it in. But some thoughts that are coming to my mind is that when I see somebody of a different color, there's actually, for me, more of an awareness that I may not know your experience. But if I see somebody who looks like me, I make an assumption I know your experience. It's like, that's crazy, right? That's a crazy kind of thing. So I think what we need to understand is this concept of mentalization, right? Is that when we mentalization by I think is Fanegi, talks about that mentalization is when we're able to see ourselves as other people see us from outside, and we're able to see other people as if they see themselves from their inside, right? We're mentalizing. We're able to stop these projections that we have of, I think I know you, or I think I know your experience, I think I know what's going on with you. And I stop and I really listen, and I really, I really take time to see who you are, really, and I take time to see how you see me, right? That's how, and it's, you know, in that avatar, they go, I see you, right? You know, right. So I think that we kind of have these dialogues when we're talking about somebody who we see as different, but we're all different. And whenever I don't do that, I tend to project my own internal world onto them. Right. And I think what we're saying is, anytime we're projecting our internal world, there's a high likelihood that that's a microaggression. That when somebody doesn't see you, when somebody doesn't get to know you, there's a high likelihood that they're taking their stuff and putting it onto you, and in that place, invalidating you as another human being. Right. So I think that we could take from this, you know, whether you're gay, whether you're black, whether you're yellow, whether you're white, the only way we know each other is when I take time to really be open and curious and suspend my own belief systems to hear what you have to say, right? And I think that the other person has to somehow tolerate, you don't know what you're doing, and you're coming here in an open and curious way, yes, as not a threat, that somehow that's a threat, and then they meet, right? And I think sometimes when people come open and curious, then the other person projects their stuff onto that experience, and we don't get it. Both people have to suspend their own histories to get to know the person in front of them. So I think that's really easy to say, hard to do, right? Because we're either open or we're projecting. Those are, right? Or somewhere in between, we're open and projecting. But really the ideal place is to find a place where you can really get to know somebody and they can get to know you. I mean, I think that what it comes down to, Matt. And so, and in our world, that's a hard place because it requires a sense of vulnerability, of being vulnerable with another human being, and that's scary for all of us.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mel, just any last thoughts as we kind of wrap up here? I knew you'd bring a ton of wisdom to this, and you have. And just any other final thoughts for our listeners? But before I try to convince you to come back in a few episodes and continue this conversation with us.
I think just to highlight what Jerry's saying about the idea of coming to some of these conversations with a sense of vulnerability. And if we can hold that on the forefront in terms of how we intend to interact, then there's little room for ego to take over. And so what does that even mean, for leaders? Because there's if you're coming from a place of vulnerability as a leader, that's a big thing that could turn out to be something much bigger. Yeah. If you're not mindful about how that gets communicated. So if I'm with students, I'm talking with students all the time about, I'm going to give you pieces of me that the average person is not going to have, because I want you to understand the context that I come from and what that means when perhaps you get someone that looks like me, who has some similarities to me, whose story isn't going to be exactly the same, but how are you going to be with them? And can you be vulnerable enough around who you are and who they are to just connect? And so I think that vulnerability is the key. And so I think that's a wonderful thing to end on.
Awesome. Sounds great. And just a reminder, all you got to do right now in this time and space is turn on the news to see how we're not connecting across those lines and how we're more reactive as a country. And I know there's so much great work being done that doesn't make the news, but we're so at each other. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody, because there's so many triggers out there that I think as people who care enough to listen to this podcast, learn more about trauma, trying to find those opportunities where we become vulnerable to learn from others. Even if my struggle is, at this point of trying to listen to white people to understand where the hell we're coming from. So this always is challenging. And so, but to be vulnerable, to listen and to reach out to people that might not have the same view that you have, might be different with you either philosophically or in any other way, and try to learn something from them. And when I do that, I understand them in such a much deeper way, and usually find that there is so much stuff that we share in common. That we can build relationships off of, even though some pieces, whether that's, a different race or a different political philosophy, might stay different, that there's so many ways that we can connect. And when we connect, we can move forward, hopefully in a positive direction. So Dr. Melody Brown, thank you so much for your time today. We will have you back, my friend. You were a great guest and a lot of wisdom there. Melody, do you mind sharing? We will put this on traumainformedlens.org in the show notes, but maybe if anybody wants to reach out to you as the experts you are on so many things around these issues, we'll put Melody's way to get in contact with her. And show notes, we've got discussion questions. This may be one of the most critical episodes, hopefully, if you can take this to your school or your organization to continue these conversations. Because again, we may unintentionally be, through our language or other things, identify areas where we might unconsciously be doing some of this as well. And it's just looking at ourselves as progressing in a positive direction is so key. So thank you, Melody. Thank you, Jerry. I know Curt's on the road to Loveland. Jerry, again, give our apologies to our Canadian friends up there.
Please.
Yes, we love them.
We don't know if I want to be that vulnerable.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, please hold my guilt up there and apologize for our country. But I will stop at that note. Again, you can find show notes and all kinds of resources. We'll put links to the books mentioned at traumainformedlens.org. So, Melody, thanks again. Jerry, thanks. And everybody, we'll see you next week. Episode 41, we've got a really great episode on talking about how repeated experiences and how that impacts arousal levels. Really cool stuff. So join us for that next week. So thanks very much.
Bye.
That's a wrap.